Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining the show tonight. Welcome. If you have never been here before, appreciate you viewing this show. This is where we don't let any of the nonsense get to us here on this channel. We are not blinded by the establishment. If you're brand new here. So whether you want to call yourself left or right, it doesn't matter. You're all welcome here. The one thing that you have to be, if there's going to be anything because you're part of this special club, is you have to understand that everything that the media feeds us, or at least a lot of it, and a lot of the stuff that we're hearing from the government is a bunch of bull. That is kind of the premise of this channel. So welcome if you are brand new. If you've been here before, thank you for watching. Again, appreciate you. Tonight we've got a special show. I do have an interview that I want to air for you. This is with Rudy Rockman. He is an Israeli Zionist activist. I did record this interview earlier this morning. So because he is in Israel and I'm here in the US and LA. And so in order to coordinate it, we needed to do it this morning because now it's in the middle of his night. So I will be airing that interview. It's about 55 minutes long, and you guys will be watching that tonight and really watching the conversation between Rudy and I about really what his vision of a solution is for the conflict that is going on in the Middle East between Israel and Palestine. So that is coming up tonight. Really excited for that interview for you guys to watch. As you know, many of you know that talk a lot about the conflict. And so it's good to get somebody on here who has maybe a different perspective or a fresh perspective, which I would say he has more of a fresh perspective. I think you might be very surprised by what he has to say. So be sure to continue watching to watch for that interview. But first, I do want to respond to an email tonight that came into my inbox over the weekend. And this is a pretty typical email. So this is why I want to share it with you, because as we've been talking more and more about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I've been receiving more and more of these types of emails. And these emails come from people who typically, they're on all sides, whether they be progressive or more conservative, but they definitely do tend to be more on the Israeli side of the conflict. And they're kind of expressing their support for Israel and also sometimes their disdain for Palestine or Palestinians. And I get this email a lot. And I think we also hear this same sort of question come up just in social media. We see it all the time on the news. We're hearing this question come up a lot. So I want to first start off the show tonight by reading off this email and what my response was to this email. So this comes from Shlomo. Believe he is in Israel. Might not be, but I believe he is. And he says about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and your channel. He says, I used to watch your videos. I'm less progressive than you, but I like progressives who are trying to tell the truth and not just the establishment propaganda. Because remember, this channel is all about anti-establishment and defeating the establishment propaganda. He says, I had the impression that you are of this type. Let's focus on the Hamas due to the latest conflict, he says. I don't understand how a progressive can support the Hamas. This is a regime of hardcore fascism, authoritarian ultranationalism. I'm sure that you will be against fascism in the U.S. If fascism is very bad for America, why is it good for the Palestinians in Gaza? They are human beings, exactly like you and I, and if fascism is bad for America, it is bad for Gaza. I detect some racism in the progressives that support Hamas. The reason is that I get the impression that some progressives think that fascism isn't that bad for Gaza since people there are inherently inferior to Americans. Isn't this racism? You should read the Hamas charter. You will be surprised. It is written there that the land of Israel belongs to the Islam, not to the Palestinians. Consequently, only Muslims can live in Israel. How can there be a peace with a regime of this type? There were 3 wars in the last decade. By the way, how is the state of women's rights in Gaza? So this sort of question, you could see what he's basically alluding to. And this is a similar question I receive often on the channel and just throughout life. And like I said, in social media, and we're seeing this kind of question tossed around a lot, which is, how can progressives support a group of people who are clearly backwards, clearly are repressive in nature. They don't give rights to women or rights to gays. They're not liberal by any stretch of the imagination. So how can people support this group that is clearly ultra conservative? And when you compare them to Israelis, where, Israel and Tel Aviv is a haven, a safe haven for those with alternative lifestyles. It's very much a safe haven for gays in the Middle East. And women have equal rights in Israel. So why would progressives support Palestinians and Hamas, who are clearly more conservative, or, whatever you want to prescribe to them, over the Israelis? So that is a question that I think comes up a lot, particularly in conservative circles, mostly conservative circles. They ask this question. They kind of, they throw it around with one another, like, how can progressives and liberals do this? Don't they know that these people are the most anti-liberal of all, so why would they support them? Well, I'm going to read to you my response to Shlomo and his question. And this is a response to all who pose a similar question. And that is, a progressive understands that it is not their place to force others into their way of life, but instead, progressives understand that people should be free to live as they choose, even if it's different to their own way of life. I don't support Hamas. I support their right to self-determination. A real progressive doesn't choose to wage war because they think people aren't progressive enough. I don't believe ultra-conservative religious Christians, Jews, nor Muslims should be fought. The people within those communities will decide how they want to live, and often progress is made through time as people within those communities fight for more equality. No one waged war against the U.S. for slavery, women not having the right to vote, or gays not being able to marry. We don't blow people up or suppress them because they aren't enlightened. I am against human rights abuses. I am against them even when they are inflicted on a terrorist or a prisoner, let alone a conservative group of people. I don't believe in torture or the death penalty, even for the worst of the worst of the worst. So why would I say, quote, sure, blow them up, make them suffer? They are backwards thinking people, so it serves them right, unquote. These are not good excuses. So to expand on that a little bit more, first of all, for me, even though I do say everyone is welcome on this show to be here to watch, I do classify myself as a progressive liberal. Although lately, I don't really feel like I identify with a lot of people who share that title. So I feel like I'm more of a social libertarian in ways. Economically, maybe I do tend to lean more, I like the Scandinavian model of things economically, but socially, I'm definitely more, I would say, liberal than what a lot of I don't feel like liberals these days are very liberal when it comes to social issues, free speech, and whatnot. I don't prescribe to cancel culture or censorship or any of these things. So, and I also don't believe, and I kind of feel like there's this trend in those who claim to be liberal, this trend to sort of force people into their way of thinking, or they say to people, well, you're backwards, you're too conservative for me, and so I'm going to force you to live my way. So there's sort of this rise of this authoritative liberal where they're going to force people into being liberal, and that's not my bag. So I'm not into that at all either. I feel as a true social liberal that you should be free to live as you want to live, even if that way you want to live is very different than the way I would choose to live. So if you want to be ultra conservative and live in a community with other ultra conservative people who want to make laws that are ultra conservative, and you all agree on that, then more power to you. You should be free to do that. I don't believe that somebody who thinks that they are more progressive or enlightened in some way should come into your community and tell you how to live. I don't feel like me, as a Los Angelino in California, should go into places in Alabama and tell them, hey, you're going to live by my rules now because I said so and I feel like my rules are better than your rules. No, I believe people in Alabama will make their rules. I might not agree with those rules at all, but I believe they have the right to self-determination there. It's their community, the way they want to live. If they want to mandate that women, can't wear tank tops, I suppose they could do that if everybody agrees with that in their community. If that's something the majority of them, I suppose, want, then I guess they're free to do that. Same with the Taliban. I'm not a supporter of the Taliban. I don't think, oh yeah, these guys are great or anything by any stretch of any imagination. But I also recognize that whether I understand it or not, there are people, lots of them, who choose to live that lifestyle. And for them, it is a choice. I mean, sure, maybe you can make the argument that for some it isn't, but a lot of them do want to live that way. And I understand this intimately because I was very religious for a very long time in my life. I was Mormon and happily Mormon. I prescribed to Mormon ideology and rules, and I did that willingly. And it was very conservative. And I chose to live that way, but it was my choice to do so. And I wanted to live in a community that shared my values at that time. Albeit I was a very liberal Mormon, and so ultimately I didn't really fit in as much. I think now things maybe have changed a little bit, but at the time I certainly didn't, which is why I'm no longer Mormon. Okay, so, but I do believe, and I've seen, I grew up in Idaho. I've lived all over this country. I've lived in New York, California, Utah, Texas. I've lived in Illinois, Indiana. I've lived all over the country. I've also lived in France. I've lived in Italy. So I've spent a lot of time in a lot of varieties of places, and I understand that people want to live based on what their lifestyle is based on a variety of factors, from religion to culture to community to groupthink, whatever it is that makes them tick. That is, people should have the right to choose to live how they want to live. And that includes ultra-religious conservative Muslims, including those who want to live under Sharia law, whatever it might be. Again, I don't think we then go and wage war with these people because we say we don't like your lifestyle. That is one of the issues that has marched us into war. It has kept us at war. It is something that no other country has done to our country in order to get us to behave or bend to the way that they think is best. Like I said, no one has waged war with the United States over slavery. We waged war with ourselves. That was a civil war. But we didn't have some outside force come in and say, you people are harming this other group and we're going to wage war against you so that you change your ways. I don't know how well that would have worked. We don't have any other country that has marched over here and said, we're going to force you into allowing gay marriage. That was something we did on our own. We don't have countries threatening us right now saying we're going to force you into legalizing weed because you're authoritative over everybody in your country and you're not letting them live life the way they want to live it. We don't have anybody marching in telling us these things. Wars should not be waged over cases of morality. So again, a progressive, if you're really truly liberal or progressive, or even just, I think, maybe a humane person in a lot of ways. Although, look, I get it. I sometimes have this feeling because I'm against the death penalty, but sometimes I struggle and I think, gosh, but that person really deserved it. That person did some really, really heinous crime, and maybe that person deserves the death penalty. But ultimately, my ethics tell me, no, that is wrong. I do not believe in killing anyone for anything that they've done. I just don't believe in killing people. So I don't believe in the death penalty for even the most heinous people within our community. I don't believe in torture for even the most heinous of known terrorists. So why would I then think that it's okay to suppress and wage war or harm a group of people simply because I think maybe they live a lifestyle that is way too ultra-conservative and oppressive? I just don't think that is actually a progressive or liberal value. So I do think that there is, one thing where I think Shlomo has things right, and where I think we're seeing this trend, which is kind of causing conservatives to have this conversation inside their circle where they say, oh, look at these liberals and how, they're defending this really ultra-conservative, non-liberal group. Like, how could they do that? How could they not defend the liberals who are the Israelis, but they're defending the conservatives? I think one place where Shlomo and those who feel that way have this right is I do think that there is a bit of, on the left, I think that there are people who don't really seem to recognize the fact that many Muslims in the Middle East, including many Palestinians, are very, very conservative. And if they had the ability to rule an area, they would make laws, because they do inside of their own communities, that are very ultra conservative and what I would consider not liberal. Values and laws that I would not want to live under personally at all. So I do think that that is something that the left tends to overlook and tends to be unrealistic about. So I try to avoid that. This is one of the reasons why I haven't supported a one-state solution. I don't think that you could inflict on, you've got a majority of people who are very conservative in the area compared to a minority. And if you were to allow that majority the rule over the minority, they would potentially suppress them or oppress them. And that would be that. I also don't believe that people should be forced to live a lifestyle that they don't want to live. And unfortunately, one of the realities of this, though I have this feeling inside of me where I say, look, I don't want to force my California, Los Angelino way of life on somebody in Alabama, I recognize full well that that person in Alabama might not share that same outlook. They instead absolutely might feel like if they're in control, they get to decide how I live my life. I'm fully aware of that. I'm not naive to that at all. I understand that I might be a free person and a liberal-minded person, but others are absolutely not and would absolutely try to control me in some sort of authoritarian manner, and that could come from the left or the right. So I'm not naive to that, and I don't think any of us should be when it comes to this particular conflict or really any other. I think we need to be aware of the fact that sometimes the minority, there's a tendency, I think, on the left to sort of make the minority such an underdog that they turn them into a victim 100% of the time. And they're a victim that can do no wrong, right? They sort of turn them into these sad victims that are always blameless and they're always good. And there's this big, bad, meanie, oppressive. And, the little guy just doesn't deserve it. And if the little guy were just allowed to be free, then everything would be okay. This is a lot of the beef I have with the conversation about racism in America. I think that there's this misnomer amongst white Americans in particular who believe that minority groups are all just waiting to be accepted by the white man. And once minority groups are accepted by the white man, then we all hold hands and, and everything's good and we sing Kumbaya. When in reality, a lot of racism exists inside those minority groups. Asians, Latinos, blacks, a lot of racism inside of those groups against one another and against whites. That's a reality that I don't think people are actually facing or even acknowledging. And if you acknowledge it, then you're, automatically lumped on one side or the other. And that is what we try to avoid. What we try to avoid here on this show and what we're trying to get people to avoid is kind of that grouping people and boxing them in just because they have one opinion that might be shared with the other side. How dare they? So I'm not naive to the fact that, Hamas is ultra conservative and not liberal by any means. And if I lived there, they would probably oppress me because I'm a woman. Absolutely. And if they got control of the entire region, they would probably do the same thing. I agree that is probably really true. But I also agree they should be allowed to live their life and govern their region the way they want and be free to do that without being blown up just because we consider them backwards. So thank you so much for your email. I love getting your emails. I do read all of them. I don't respond to most of them. I can't physically, but I do read them all. So if you would like to email me, you can do that. My email is kim@kimiversen.com. You can email me at any time. Also, if you would like to, here once again, that's kim@kimiversen.com. You can see here the email. Also, please join my Locals community. I have a great community going on at Locals. This is where you could support the show. It's $5 a month where you could get some exclusive content. I'm now going to start rolling out more exclusive content on Locals and on Rokfin because I don't really have the freedom that I have on YouTube anymore. And that is slowly dwindling. I do believe that YouTube is moving in a direction where they're trying to get rid of all pundits, all political news pundits. They're trying to wipe all of us off of their platform eventually. So the best way to support this show, to support independent media is by either joining my locals community for $5 a month. That mostly goes directly to me. Or you could join Rokfin, which for $10 a month, you get access to not only myself, but numerous other creators. And we don't get most of that. I mean, that gets divided up by most all of us. So just to kind of make it really, I want it to be transparent for you. When you pay to Rokfin $10 a month, it goes into crypto for the creators and it gets split between all of us. So, it's not, $10, your $10 goes to everybody. So kind of, think of it that way. But it's a great platform and it is a way for you to sort of maximize. I know with so many people now saying like $5 here, $10 here, $2 here, $1 here, right? Like everybody's asking for money. So it's really, where do you put it? Rokfin is a good place for that if you want to kind of get more bang for your buck. If you would like to support me and my show and you want more of my content, then my locals community is a great place for that. So those links are down below. That is how you can best support the show. So we are going to now, I do want to play for you this interview. This was pre-recorded, so Rudy is not here to take your super chats or your comments at the end of this show. You can still ask questions. I will do my best to answer them at the end of tonight's show. But I do want to play for you this interview, and then I will be back for an after show, guys. So thank you guys so much for watching. And here it is. This is my interview recorded earlier today with Israeli Zionist activist Rudy Rockman. Well, many of you who watch this channel know that I talk a lot about the conflict going on in Israel and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that is happening, especially after I went and traveled to the West Bank myself about a year and a half ago when I traveled over there with a group of Christian Palestinians to see the conflict firsthand. So we talk about this a lot on my channel, have covered it extensively. But one thing that I really have been wanting to do, which is what we're going to do now, is bring on an Israeli, somebody from, we would say, like the other side of the conflict, and really hear their perspective on this, because I think it's really important to hear both sides. I do get emails from a lot of Israelis asking me, hey, will you please talk about the other side, our side of the conflict, and really hear us out. And so today, lucky enough, we're able to have a very an interesting perspective on this conflict from the Israeli side. Activist Rudy Rockman. He is an Israeli Zionist activist who, at a young age, really felt passionate about this cause, about defending Jews who are facing anti-Semitism. He experienced some anti-Semitism when he was 7 years old, and his mother was kicked off a bus for being Jewish in London, of all places. When he went to college, he decided that he wanted to go to university at a school that was named the most anti-Semitic school in the United States, or really in North America, I believe, which was Columbia University. Also very shocking to sort of hear this. And he chose that university for that reason, because he says he wanted to go to a place that where he would face the anti-Semitism and try to, I think, dissolve. And we're going to hear from him so he can tell us himself, but really help kind of combat that in a way. And the best way to combat it is through dialogue, through facing one another, through sitting down with one another. And what is interesting about Rudy is that has seemed to be his method in his activism, is to really sit down and talk to one another rather than just talk to your bubble in one side and stick to one and kind of champion people who already agree with you. Rudy actually crosses over and says, let's have a conversation. And he has some interesting, I think, solutions to the conflict. So very excited to have on the show today, Rudy Rockman. Rudy, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So first of all, let's kind of go through a little bit more of your history. So you immigrated into Israel when you were young?
Yeah, I was born in France. All of my grandparents were born in different countries that had been persecuted for being Jewish. On my mother's side, they were born in Algeria and Morocco. There was a massacre of the Jewish community in Oujda in 1948, so they fled to France. My father's side of the family survived the Holocaust by fleeing into France and hiding in attics throughout the war. So I was born in France, left at 3 to Israel, and then at 5 years old moved to the US, to Miami.
Oh, so you were raised in the US.
Most of my life, yeah. We moved around even in Florida. We lived a year also in Palo Alto, back to Miami, and then I left the US at the age of 17 to Israel. But most of my early childhood from age 5 to 17 was spent in the US, yeah.
Okay. And then you went to Israel and you enlisted in the IDF.
Correct. I served in the paratroopers from 2011 to 2013.
Okay. And what made you, I mean, now you would consider yourself an Israeli Zionist activist, is that right?
Yeah, Israeli because that's the name of my nation, past 4,000 years, the nation of Israel. Jewish because I'm also Jewish, it's a synonym for that. And a Zionist because I define Zionism by what I think most Zionists define Zionism as, which is the right for the Jewish people to self-determine on their ancestral land. It has nothing to do in that definition with 1948, with Palestinians, with the conflict, with the solution. It's just the idea that the Jewish people should have a right to live there. So that's why I identify with that name. It's important to get behind the meanings behind the words that we use because words can just be syllables and sounds coming out of our mouths. But if we define them differently, then we tend to think that one person is something that we may not actually understand the terms of. So I define Zionism as the right for the Jewish people to be able to live and self-determine there. And I'm not against any other people's rights to live there as well. I'm actually very much so pro-Palestinian. I think the only future we can create is to create a free land from the river to the sea for all inhabitants of this land.
Yeah, I think that's going to be tough. I think that's going to be tough. But you know, actually, when I was over there, I sat down with a Palestinian who also is he's a Jerusalemite Palestinian. And for those who are watching, because it's this conflict is extremely it's complex, I think, for people. So for people to understand, a Palestinian Jerusalemite has sort of a different citizenship, I would say, or different papers, different privileges than Palestinians who live in the West Bank. So if you're a Jerusalemite, you're actually able, correct me if I'm wrong, Rudy, but you're able to travel really anywhere in all of Israel,
Mhm.
and in the West Bank as well, right? They're able to go everywhere.
Yeah, so they sort of have like a residence rights. So you'd be able to travel anywhere in Israel as a resident. They're not able to vote because they're not given citizenship. They were actually offered a few times and rejected it.
Hmm.
And they are able to go into Area A. Even Israeli Arabs that have full citizenship or Israeli Palestinians, whatever one chooses to identify with, are technically allowed to go into Area A, although there's signs outside saying forbidden for any Israeli. It's really applied only for Jewish Israelis. So I,
Right,
as a Jew,
right.
cannot enter into Area A, cannot live into Area B. No one could enter Gaza because of the blockade and also the situation there. So there's really a division of movement and separation of land that I think is unjust for all. That's something I'm definitely against. And I think a lot of Israelis and Palestinians are starting to wake up that the reality that we experience may be different, but the future that we'd like to see is pretty much the same. And so if we start to unite rather than to fight each other, then maybe we can get there.
Do you face a lot of opposition for this? So let me just finish my thought there. When I was sitting down with this Palestinian Jerusalemite, he ended up with a similar, uh, what his outcome for the nation and the conflict was the same as you, which I thought was really interesting because you're both really for a one state solution, maybe a federation, kind of a two states, one country, like or some sort of one state solution. I mean, I'll let you explain specifically, but you know, for me, I identify as a person who's a progressive on the left. I don't really kind of identify with it these days. It's kind of morphed into something. But when it comes to this particular conflict, I find myself sort of on an island in between two sides because I don't agree really with either side on it. I don't agree with the left that's saying one state solution, this is apartheid, everybody just needs to intermix. I think there's serious challenges with that. And on the right who just say no, you know, I mean, I don't agree with sort of the narrative that comes from there either. I'm a big supporter of a two-state solution. I don't know how you get to a one state on this, but what's interesting is you believe it, and so does this, so does this Jerusalemite Palestinian. So I mean, and you guys live there, so I guess, but I just don't know how you can see the two groups mixing in a way that would work. And my fear would be that, I mean, look, you know, as much as I am an actor, I wouldn't say an activist, but somebody who definitely is trying to help sort of shed light on the Palestinian plight, and definitely would like to see the human rights abuses end for the Palestinians and what's going on. I also know they're really conservative, and mixing the two groups would mean, with them being a majority, that I think a lot of the rights that the Israelis enjoy, you know, gay rights and freedoms that for women, and there's a lot of things there that I worry would go away. I mean, what do you think of? I mean, how do you see it? So there's that. Secondly, I do think that there is a lot of anger on the Palestinian side, and I think a lot of it is rightfully so. But I think sometimes when people are really angry, they tend to want to get revenge or lash out. And I worry also with them being a majority that if you guys were to mix together fully, where you gave them equal rights, so that would be equal voting rights, that one of the things that they would do right away is change the name of the country. They wouldn't call it Israel. It couldn't be a Jewish nation. I mean, how do you see this working? It's so interesting to me. What is, with your perspective, what would you like to see?
Yeah, so definitely a lot to go over there. I took some notes to not forget anything. But I do appreciate you not falling prey into any sort of right wing or left wing side. And it's something that I think most people should start doing, realizing that, we have values, we have ideas, we're individuals. We should also have the humility to accept that we can evolve and change our minds and see things differently or understand truth or reality in a more holistic way. So it's important not to be stuck on this is what the right says and I'm on the right, or this is what the left says and I'm on the left, but also be more open to ideas in itself. So let's review the options we have on the table. The options are the Israelis kill all the Palestinians or the Palestinians kill all the Israelis. That's obviously not going to happen.
Right.
The Israelis kick out all the Palestinians kick out all the Israelis. That's obviously not going to happen. We continue the status quo. That's obviously a horrible situation where people continue to suffer, or we create something that's completely revolutionary that hasn't been tried before, that actually works for both people to live together. So I don't talk about a one state solution, because I think a one state solution just means the extension of what currently exists in Israel, extending it to the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, to Gaza. And I don't think that's something that really works. I mean, even the current state of Israel that we have today doesn't work for its population. We're probably going on to our fifth election. There's complete division between the right, the left, the religious, the secular, Israeli Jew, Israeli Arab. And it's a structure that was built understandably in 1948 without much time or process to create something that would envision working in the long term, that clearly is not functional, and we need some sort of revolutionary change within the system to also be inclusive of Palestinians. So instead of one state, I say one civilization. And it's intentionally more vague because it allows other options to come to the table, such as what you mentioned, the federation plan, which I think has a lot of validity, which focuses more on regions, which is how Middle Easterners, Jews also, we had 12 tribes, we were governed regionally. Palestinians, the way they're governed is by, you go to Nablus, you go to Hebron, you go to Ramallah, you go to all these places, you usually have a family or two or three that are the ones that control the community, and that's how they've always governed themselves and how they would want to govern themselves. So I think if we start having a conversation of what kind of new system we can build, maybe it's something that has sort of two branches of government. We have the Knesset and we have a federation plan where area A and B and C within the West Bank would become parts of federations. We'd have 8 different federations and people would vote based on where they live. So if I, as a Jew, were to live in one of these areas, I would vote there and not for the Knesset. And if a Palestinian were to move to Tel Aviv, to Haifa, or Beersheba, or where is today considered the state of Israel, they would then vote for the Knesset. There are many different variations of what a federation plan can look like, but it's something that many people need to understand, that Israelis and Palestinians don't see this land as just a piece of territory or property that we can buy, sell, and trade. We see it as our soulmate. So I don't know if you saw the movie that was very famous years ago of the Avatar. So there was this ancient alien blue people.
Right.
Just imagine putting yourself into that scene. The connection and relationship that they have to the land is the relationship that natives have to the land. So if someone comes and tells them, split your tree into two or your land into two, it's not going to happen. So to split our land into two is like splitting our soulmate into two. And neither the Israelis or Palestinians want to see that. We want to see from the river to the sea, one land with rights for all, without limitation of movement. I should be able to go to area A and to area B. Palestinians should be able to go into Israel. And that's at the end of the day what most people want. Now, there's some things that I do want to go over in terms of the situation. It is clearly filled with injustice. It is clearly filled where people cannot access, resources, access movement, access education, access jobs, under the control of a foreign army that is controlling your day-to-day life that you have no representation over. So there's clearly plenty of injustice to go over. However, using terms like apartheid, I think are inaccurate and I think are also harmful.
Yeah.
Because one, I think apartheid is a term that specifically talks about an experience in South Africa, and I don't think anyone should appropriate that term that was created to talk about that experience. And also, apartheid in South Africa is one country, one land, one government with different rights for different peoples based on their skin color.
Right. This is
Right now
different.
we
I
have
mean, right. I mean,
right, you have
that's one thing that I've always kind of combated with the narrative on it is that I don't agree with it being apartheid. This is also where I separate a bit from
right.
the leftist narrative on this, is that it was very clear to me from when I was there that it was military occupation of another group's land. It wasn't apartheid, but it was definite, because really that would be, like you said, one government, one sort of law, a set of laws for two different people, but they're laws. And what I witnessed in the West Bank was fluctuating laws based on military order, military sort of military control of day-to-day life, minus Area A. But beyond that, it really looked to me like, I mean, would you say that it's military occupation?
Well, yeah, I would say that the land is divided into three areas, like you said, Area A, B, and C. Under Area A, the Palestinian Authority has full control. And this
Right.
was also agreed upon by both leaderships, which is an idea I reject. We should have never divided this land. But both the Palestinian leadership and the Israeli government, in the Oslo Accord and in the 1995 agreement afterwards, agreed that this would be the way that they would divide land. Now it's a system that is completely filled with ways to just have more and more injustice that is created, but is not something that was imposed. It is something that was agreed upon, and it was also something that was pushed by foreign countries like America, telling people that we need to do this. And I think this has kind of been the overwhelming theme that we've seen throughout the history of the land, where the British are telling the Jews and the Arabs, Israelis and Palestinians, that we need to divide the land and we can't live together. Or the Americans are coming and telling us the only way to live together is for you to separate, when fundamentally any Israeli and any Palestinian that is pushing the aspirations of their people, which are the vast majority of people, care about this land being one. That doesn't mean they necessarily care about the other, which is something that we need to fix, because they don't recognize each other, they don't understand each other, and we think that the other's existence prevents us from achieving our aspirations, which it doesn't, which is what I'm trying to heal. But the reality is that both people see this land as one. So any conversation, I think, of
Right.
dividing this land is preventing us from actually focusing on solutions that could work. Beyond that, let's look at the fact that we have 600,000 Jews living in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, and they all have guns. So any possibility of even this idea of creating a two-state would just create a civil war. Those Jews would fight. 90% of combat officers come from families that come from those communities. You would see a mutiny in Israel. You would see a civil war. And what does that mean? We remove 600,000 Jews from Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, back into Israel, and we remove all the 20% of Israel's population, Israeli Arabs, and we put them there. We should not be displacing anybody, and we should be focusing on creating a reality that can fulfill the aspirations of both peoples and end the
Well,
injustices. And I don't think a two-state solution does that for either.
but one thing with the two-state solution is that really only the Israeli side says that they're trying to create a Jewish nation. The
Mm.
Palestinians don't really say that. I mean, they never say, "Hey, we're a nation just for Arabs or just for Muslims," or that's. I mean, Ramallah was historically really a Christian town. I believe even the government still in Ramallah is Christian. So, I don't think there's on their side this notion of we're just for one group of people. So, one thing that I've always thought with the two-state solution would be if you landed on that side of the wall, then now you live in Palestine under Palestinian government. And if you don't like it, I guess you can immigrate back to the Israeli side. You don't have to live there. If you want to live there, you can. They're not, I mean, I met Palestinian Jews. They're not saying you can't be here. I think that is from my experience from being over there that only the Israeli side says if you're not Jewish, you have fewer rights, even if you're an Israeli. Well, you have the same human rights, but you have different community rights, right? So an Arab Israeli is not able to do of certain things, or from what I understand, they're not able to maybe serve in the IDF or gain
No,
privileges from that.
they can. They don't have to serve in the IDF.
Oh,
It's
they
very
don't have
different
to.
than
Okay.
like you have many Israeli Arabs that serve in the IDF. I would say it's actually a privilege because they don't have to spend 3 years when they're 18 years old to go and serve in an army. They can go and pursue whatever education that they want, which is why Israeli Arabs make up 20% of the population and make up over 40% of doctors and nurses, is because usually those career paths takes a long time to study, and Israeli Jews have to do the army 3 years plus work 1 year plus travel 1 year. They come back and they usually don't go into the paths which require years of school. That being said, the rights for Israelis, Israeli Jews, and Israeli Arabs are the same. When it comes to Palestinians, it isn't, and that's a reality that we should change. I do want to touch on the fact that in the Declaration of Independence of Israel, it says it's a state equal and free for all. and Israeli Arabs were given rights, right away and included into the society. So I don't think it's accurate to say that the goals of Israel, whether early or today, is to not create a civilization equal for all. We do want a Jewish state, but I think people need to understand first what Jewish means. And I think because they don't understand what Jewish means in the first place, they tend to think that we're talking about a Christian state or a Muslim state or a religious state. And that's not what it means, because Judaism is actually not a religion. Because a religion is a belief system in a God, deity, book, or a prophet. So if you're a Christian and you reject Jesus, you're not a Christian. And if you're an individual and you accept Jesus, you become a Christian. So it's based on if you accept or reject a belief system. Same thing in Islam. You accept Muhammad, you're a Muslim. You reject Muhammad, you're not a Muslim. Buddhism, you accept the philosophies of Buddha, you're a Buddhist. You reject, you're not a Buddhist. But in Judaism, even if you reject the Torah and Hashem or God in the Bible, you're still a Jew. Not any more, not any less than someone who believes. And to become a Jew, there is a process, but you have to adopt an identity, a history, a culture, a value system, connection to a land, aspiration, suffering. You're joining a civilization, you're joining a nation. And actually, native nations like Native American nations have a very similar process in which one can become a Native American through going almost through the identical process. So when we're talking about a Jewish civilization, we're talking about reviving a civilization of a native people. The same way if the Tibetans were to go back to Tibet, they would be reviving a Tibetan civilization. That doesn't mean it's a religious civilization. Of course, Tibetans also have spiritual elements of their culture, like Jews, like Maoris, like Aboriginals, like Native Americans, but it's basically reviving the civilization that fits the needs of the Jewish peoples. Now, unfortunately, we didn't do that in a way that also fits the needs of the Palestinians, which if you break down the needs of Palestinians and Israelis, they actually don't contradict. Because what one needs and what the other needs, it doesn't go against each other. So what we should have done in 1948 is we should have had a conversation with all the inhabitants of the land, including Palestinians, which most people don't even know that 30 to 60% of Palestinian ancestry actually comes from Jewish ancestry. Many Jews that were converted to Islam or to Christianity eventually became Arabized with the time and now identify as Palestinian, mixed with other people who moved in. It's a new hybrid identity that existed over the past 2,000 years, but it's a real valid identity that comes from this land, and so does the Jewish identity. So instead of coming together and building something that would work so that when I experience this land, it's a Jewish civilization, and when Palestinians experience this land, it's a Palestinian civilization, we were right away in 1948 put against each other. Why?
Yeah.
Because the British convinced both sides, and this is what they're masters of, that each other was the enemy to each other's story. And that's exactly what they did in India, Pakistan, in the ethnic groups of Nigeria, in the ethnic groups of Afghanistan. They convinced the Palestinians that the Jews were just these white people from Europe that were an extension of the West coming to colonize the rest of the Middle East, which were not. First of all, more than half of the Jewish population in Israel never even had an experience in Europe. And even the Jews living in Europe were never considered white, were always mistreated, were always second-class citizens, and were massacred for not being part of the Aryan race. And even today, we go to New York, which has 13% of the population being Jewish and over 54% of the hate crimes totally being against Jews. So where's our white privilege, even when we're living today in white countries? So the reality is that they were taught that the Israelis were the extension of white people, which were their enemy. And we were told that the Palestinians were an extension of this pan-Arab arm that wanted to come and make everything Arab and to remove Jews. So we were convinced that instead of living together and finding a way to live together, that each other's groups represented the demise of our futures.
Right.
And because of that, we ended up fighting in war. And now we're seeing the consequences of 73 years plus of constant ethnic conflict.
Well, but I totally understand the historical, and I understand the desire for the Jewish diaspora to say, hey, we want to go back to our original ancestral home. I understand where that desire would come from, especially since, like, as no one wants to be a minority everywhere they go, and that's how the Jewish people have been, just constantly forced into being a minority everywhere. And I understand people want to have a place where they say, hey, we want one place where we're at least not the minority, where we're the majority and it's ours. I understand that, definitely, that sentiment. I think the problem that, the Palestinians have is I don't think they dispute the history from what but I think that there is this feeling of being forced to share. So it's, the mass immigration of the diaspora to come back in and repopulate the region. I don't think that idea goes well with anyone. I mean, here in the United States, if the Mexicans said, hey, listen, we're going to, if we got a leader in power that said, California and Texas, these areas have been historically Mexico, and the Mexican people were kind of driven out during the wars and whatnot. And so maybe we should allow them to come back. And, here in California now, we are more than 50%, I think, Latino. But that doesn't go well, right? So there would be a lot of Americans who would push back on that idea and say, whoa, 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 now you're telling me just because of history that I now have to share this land that I've built up or that I've been living on. I just don't know how that would go with any group of people. And so the Palestinians that are there, they're feeling like there's been this force of them to share things, land, even holy sites. So there's this, so they're feeling like they're being pushed. And, you know, I wouldn't like it either if the government suddenly came to me and said, you have to, split half your house. And now this person who used to inhabit your land, or really like here in America, none of us come from here. I mean, except for Native Americans, the rest of us come from other places. My family comes from Vietnam and Denmark. So, I mean, I don't feel like I could go back to Denmark and then say, go to Vila and say, hey, this is my family farm. My family had lived on this farm forever until my family felt like they had to leave during World War I. So, you know, I want to come back, and now you have to share it with me. I mean, I don't know how that sentiment goes well with anyone. So I think there's a challenge there. Don't you? I mean, don't you think that's a giant challenge in the mentality?
There's a few things. First of all, I think the example of Americans and Mexicans doesn't work because Americans do descend, at least white Americans, from a foreign people. And also,
Right.
since then, there has been a country that exists. Regardless of the origins, today America exists. Since Judea being destroyed 2,000 years ago, no country existed. It went from colonial rule, colonial rule, colonial rule, different empires, but never was there a country that existed. Also, the vast majority of land was uninhabited. So it's not as if the Jews are coming back, they have to split the land and live in the same house. They would be able to buy the homes or to build homes in land that wasn't connected to anyone else. We didn't have to have a separation. Even if today, I'm sure if you came to Israel, I don't know if you got the chance to go to Eilat to the south, but when you drive in the south, you're hours and hours just driving with nothing. So
Right.
there's plenty of room, even in this land. This idea that we couldn't live together is, I think, something that we were told. And if we look from the Palestinian side, the person that was put as a sort of representative by the British, obviously not elected by the Palestinians, but by the British, was Haj Amin al-Husseini. And Haj Amin al-Husseini even met with Hitler and said, when Hitler is done with the Jews in Europe, come to Palestine and kill all the Jews. And this was the person that kind of portrayed propaganda to the Palestinian people that the idea of Jews coming in here would result in you being removed. When Jews coming in never said, we need Palestinians out, we should be able to live together. And again, we're talking about two groups that are native to this land, two
Right.
groups that are from this land. So we used to always live together. Even there was never a time in history without Jews in this land. It's not
Right.
as if all the Jews came back. There were still Jews living here. So we could have very
But a
well
real big
been able
minority.
to.
I mean, a minority. I
Yes,
mean,
a
it had
minority
gotten
for
to a
sure,
point, yeah,
for sure,
where it was very few,
no
and
doubt.
then it's kind of
Well, there was
grown and
very few
really
in total. I
exploded.
mean, we had under 1 million people living in the land prior to 1948 as a whole. So
Yeah.
yeah, there were a few Jews, but there were just a few people overall. The land was mostly uninhabited. So definitely the fact that like there are minority of Jews doesn't mean that the majority of Palestinians or Arabs or even the Jews then identified as Palestinian, because everyone identified as Palestinian then because that was the name of the land and that's how they identified. But let's say the majority that weren't Jewish, they would still be able to live in the land as Jews would return or as other people would return to this land. This didn't have to be the point in which we experienced this feeling of being kicked out. I think the reason for why Palestinians feel kicked out is because they were physically kicked out. And the reason they were physically kicked out is because there was a war. The
Right.
reason there was a war is because we were divided in our minds and thought the only way to survive is to fight each other, not because we needed to in the first place.
Well, and also I think that the original the not the original, I mean, because we could go back 4,000 years, but the inhabitants at that time, right, in the early 1900s were mostly Arab. And
Yes.
so they were hearing this new idea that there was going to be an influx and that it was going to be supported by the British, that were going to be allowing the influx of this new group of people to them new group. I mean, look, I understand the history of, like I said, thousands of years, but you and I did not live thousands of years ago. We live now today. I don't believe in any right to return at all for anyone. I just think that that's an odd notion that we somehow get this, like I said, I come from Vietnam and Denmark. I don't believe I have a right to return to either of those lands and say, hey, this was mine now because of my ancestry. I mean, I feel like I was born here in America, therefore, this is where I live. That is also why I don't believe in telling all of these Israelis, now you got to go, right? Because that is, if you live in there, that's your place now. That's your home. You don't, no one should be telling you to leave either. But right. So the beef, right, is that this is a new thing that has happened in the lifetime of the people living there now. There are people alive today who experienced the push out in 1948 that have been experiencing the massive influx where the Israelis are allowing Jewish people to come in and settle and live, but they do not allow Arabs as much, or Palestinians or to come back. They make it pretty difficult. I know a lot of American
They don't let
Palestinians.
any Palestinians come back. I mean,
Well,
people can,
right, to
yeah, they
Israel,
can
to the
come to
Israeli
travel.
side.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Even to the West Bank side, they make it kind of difficult.
Mhm.
For, even I know Americans who have gone back to try to build businesses in the West Bank and whatnot. It's pretty tough.
Yeah.
I just don't know how. I mean, I love your idea. I really do. I mean, if we could make it to where everybody could just live together and hold hands and sing Kumbaya, I think that would be fantastic. I just don't know. I mean, you say that, do you feel like you really do hold the majority viewpoint of the people in Israel who think, okay, this land is for all of us and we all need to live harmoniously together? Do you really think that's a majority viewpoint?
I think if you told everyone, if you can live in this land and this land would be experienced by you as a Jewish civilization, and to the Palestinian experiencing this land would be experienced as a Palestinian civilization, you wouldn't be in danger. You would be able to live life. You would have a great life, access to education, to resources, and whatever you need. Everyone would subscribe to that. The problem is that we've never actually thought about creating a path to building something that fits the needs of both peoples. It's always been either separate or one over the other. And the attempt to create something that fits the needs of both peoples, that take both into consideration, that considers the injustices that both go through and the aspirations which are different, and tries to create something based on that, is something that no one has ever tried.
Right.
So I can't, at the end of the day, we look at all the different peace deals. And also there's something that we need to understand, that if we hear the Palestinian Authority or Hamas say something, you're saying that these communities are very conservative, the leaders don't necessarily represent the people. I mean,
Right.
they're on their 15th, 16th year of their 4-year term, meaning they haven't had an election since the first election. So if Hamas is saying something, that doesn't represent the average Palestinian. If Fatah or the PA or the PLO is saying something, that doesn't represent the average Palestinian. I think when you meet day-to-day Palestinians living there, they're normal human beings that want to live with anyone else. The
Right.
problem is that because of the physical wall that exists, it creates a psychological wall as well, because we don't tend to experience one another. What Palestinians experience is only IDF soldiers, which regardless of if the IDF soldier is a good person or not, they are still someone that has a power over them that they don't have representation over, that is controlling them, not necessarily protecting them, but controlling them. So it's definitely a negative experience. And to the Israeli, of course, they are hundreds of thousands of Palestinians that work, but they usually work in building roads and building houses, so you're not really interacting with them. But the only Palestinians that you usually hear about are those that you hear in the media, or that your family friend got stabbed, or there was some bus that got blown up. So you don't experience the day-to-day normal average good human being Palestinians, which are the majority on both sides. So I think we've
Right.
been conditioned to seeing the other as our enemy because of medias, because of extremists, and because also of the physical wall, which is why I'm very much so against that wall. I'm against the fact that there are checkpoints. I'm against the fact that there's the IDF in the land. The IDF should be protecting all civilians of this land, including Palestinians, and on the borders, not in the land. We don't have the army in Tel Aviv. We don't have the army in Ranana and in Herzliya and in Beersheba and in Haifa and in all these places internally in the land of Israel. So we shouldn't
Right.
have the army in the land. We should have the army outside of the land protecting all. But in order to make those changes, we first need to have a total shift within the pop culture of the younger generation. And the younger generation is the future. And so if we can not be anti the other side, but pro both sides. And I always say, if you're anti-Palestinian, you're also anti-Israel. And if you're anti-Israel, you're also anti-Palestinian, because there's not Israel and Palestine. It's the same. Israel is Palestine. Palestine is Israel. It's one land. It has different names. It's fine to call it different things. In a future solution, if we call it two different things, I'm completely fine with that, as long as I have the rights to call it what I call it and another person has. And we need to find a way to build something that would fill the needs of both peoples. And I think we really need to invest in the younger generation to be able to transcend the generic narratives that we were fed and the reality that we live, that it's one versus the other, because it's not. It wasn't that. It hasn't been that. It was only that because we were convinced of that mentally.
Right. So I'll tell you the big challenge I see with that is I think from what I saw, the younger Palestinians are actually the more radical. So, it seemed like the older generation was like, they remembered a time when there wasn't a wall. They remembered a time when Palestinians and Jews got along together and they were friends and so the older generation seems to remember that, but the younger generation, they've only experienced that wall and they've only experienced the IDF in the way that you've explained it, where it's hostile occupation to them. That's what they're experiencing. So in my experience and my fear with this idea, which I think would be great, and I think it's the most and only probably practical solution for the Palestinians. I think at this point, if things continue on the way it continues on, they will become the Native Americans of that land. So they will be Area A's, all the Area A would essentially be various different reservations, and Palestinians would live on their reservations. They'd be able to control the reservations, but everything else is controlled by Israel, which is kind of what is going on now in a way. But the problem is that younger group really, they were the ones when you're over there, for you, it's totally normal because you live there, so you understand. But for somebody who just visits, it's odd to hear everybody calling the same place different names. And you can kind of tell how radical they are based on what they're calling it, what name they use for that region. So you'll meet, obviously there's a lot of Palestinians who call Israel, Israel, but you'll meet a lot of Palestinians who will not call it Israel at all. They won't recognize it as a country. They'll call it, the 48, or they have a variety of different names for these different
And
regions.
many Israelis that reject identifying Palestinian as Palestinian as well. That exists
Right,
on both
exactly.
sides.
Right, exactly. And it does exist on both sides, where you got Israelis who say Palestinians aren't a people and they won't even call it the West Bank or anything. They won't recognize any of the names. So there is definitely extremism on both sides. But with the Palestinians in particular, I think with the youth on the Israeli side and the youth in America, we're witnessing a shift where there is more of an attitude of everybody needs to live together. We cannot continue on like this. Kind of what you're explaining. We're hearing this shift happening in America as well. And that shift is not exactly happening on the Palestinian side. They're feeling more oppressed. And, and you can understand why, because all they have experienced is that wall and the IDF, and they've had only oppression. Their university gets shut down at random. They get, police come after them, hold them. They don't have to press charges. They can hold them for an extended period of time without due process. I mean, they've got a lot of problems that they're dealing with. And so they're becoming more and more upset. And that, I think, is so it's kind of like this circular problem. And it's the same issue we've got in Gaza with Hamas, right? It's the circular issue where the more radical they become, the harder the Israelis come at them. And then the harder they come at them, the more radical they become. And that is a huge challenge. So for me, the big challenge, I think, for Israel as a country, to be quite honest with you, I don't know how Israel remains a nation 30, 40 years from now. I'm going to be honest with you. As much as I believe that, Israel has a right to exist, I don't subscribe to, like I said, get out, the BDS movement, even because I met with some of the leaders of BDS movement, quite radical. And so shockingly radical. There are two sides that are on that fringe, and they're like, get the other side out. They need to just be taken out and they need to leave, right? They need to go.
Yeah.
This isn't their land. So you do have that real radical perspective. But I don't know, with the shift in mentality that is happening in the US, you've got a younger group of people coming up, and it's not just the liberals. That's the narrative, that it's just the liberals. It's the conservatives too. I know quite a few of them that are Republicans. They're young Republicans, but they're not Christian anymore. So they don't care. They don't believe in the Bible. They don't believe in Jews needing returned back to the Holy Land in order for Christ to come again. They don't have any of those ideas. They don't like war. They're sick of the Middle East. They want out. And so there's this huge shifting in mentality between not only the left saying apartheid, human rights abuses, and the right saying, screw it. Why are we even over? Why do we care? Let's come back to America. That the support of the US is going to go away. And then on top of it, there's going to be a lot of international pressure to remove that wall. There is going to be a lot of international pressure, or at least to stop the occupation and the human rights abuses. And in which case, if there is a shift with that narrative of apartheid in particular, and if they continue that and say it's apartheid, right, which forces then this conversation of then you have to intermix, there are more of them than there are of you. And that is why I don't see, without serious change, and I think this should be a mayday for the Israeli government. And I think you're right, the governments don't represent the people, just like the government in the United States certainly doesn't represent me. And that's most Americans would feel that way about our government. And I'm sure Israelis and Palestinians feel that about their governments too. Like most people in the world feel about their government. They don't represent the majority of the people, really. So I don't know how, in the future when the US is no longer backing Israel because Americans don't want to and don't care, and which I think is important and needs to happen. If you want to be a sovereign nation, you got to be able to defend yourself. And I don't know, with the push and the pressure from the international community, how Israel remains a nation. And particularly, like your idea, you say, well, it doesn't have to really be necessarily Jewish. It can be, but I don't know if
Well,
a
it should
lot of
be
us.
Jewish in what Jewish means, because I don't think it's Jewish in what it's Jewish means. I think the phrase I heard someone once say is that it's a sort of Western country with Jewish decorations. So it doesn't fulfill the needs of what it means to be a Jewish civilization, even today as a Jewish state. It's sort of just, we have Hebrew, we have a menorah, we have a Magen David on our flag, but that's
Right.
just superficial. That's not deep. So we want more of a deeper sense of it being a Jewish civilization, but that doesn't contradict having also the existence of a space for Palestinians to be an equal part of that society and civilization as well. So the things about the youth being radical, I mean, I think that's just natural for history. Always the youth is going to be more active, more passionate, more radical. The question is, where do they use their radical or their passion to? Do they use it towards coming together and spearheading like a movement that is revolutionary, or do they use it to be more against each other and use their energy to fight each other? So I think it depends on what the outlet and what the option is available on the table for the youth to use its energy, which is always going to be more passionate than the elder generation. But you're absolutely right that the older generation remembers a time where people were able to travel, where people were meeting each other. Most of the older generation speaks Hebrew, most of the younger generation does not.
Right.
So there's also a language barrier that exists, which is why I definitely support Palestinians learning Hebrew and Israelis learning Arabic. I'm actually working on it myself. I'm part of a movement here on the land called Habayit, which is actually an Israeli-Palestinian movement that unites both peoples and that tries to change this rhetoric and the pop culture. But there's something that we also need to recognize is that Palestinians do not have freedom of speech here.
Right.
Not those that are living under Israel, but those that are living under Hamas and the Palestinian Authority. There is no other option but to either do nothing or hate Israel / the Jews. If you normalize relations in the sense of working with Israeli activists to engage, to educate them on your narrative and their narrative and talk about a future, you get arrested for that. That's why whenever we do something, we have to blur the faces of the people we work with or change their voices because there's no protection. And this is something that I criticize the Israeli government over. So if you're protecting my life as a Jew in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, you should be protecting the right of Palestinians to also have freedom of speech so that they can be able to rise up and create another option within the society that isn't to be pro-Israel for the sake of being pro-Israel, but is pro-Palestinian and not anti the Israeli people. A way that we can live for both of us to move together. And the reality is that Israel has the responsibility to do that because it has the power. The average Palestinian does not have power. Palestinians, even the PA and Hamas, within 1 second, Israel can take them out. That doesn't mean Israel should be responsible for what PA and Hamas does or has done. But the reality is today, if Israel wanted to, it could get rid of them. I'm not saying that's the first step to do, but I think the first step to do is to prop up and to empower the real local community leaders to allow freedom of speech, to allow Palestinians to be able to speak. And this tactic of, going harsher and being harder, it's like, it's terrorism can be seen as a sort of anti-colonial tool, right? You terrorize an occupying force until they realize that it's not worth to stay there anymore, and then they leave. That's what the Jews actually did to the British. They blew up the oil refinery, they blew up the King David Hotel, and eventually the British left. Okay? When you use terrorism against the native people that just so happens to be 100 times stronger, they're going to respond 100 times stronger because they're going to die on this land, whether of old age or through war. So that tactic of being more aggressive or more fighting, whether ideologically or physically against Israelis, is not going to happen because Israelis will never leave this land because they're native to it, and Palestinians won't either. So if the other way was around and Palestinians were on top and Jews were on the bottom, Israelis were on the bottom, and we were using terrorism against them, I wouldn't expect Palestinians to leave either, and I would expect them to answer back 100 times, because we're using the wrong tactics, because we haven't understood fundamentally who we are towards each other's narratives. We're actually both from this land, and that's why I try to focus on that, for us to be able to transcend that and to be able to live together. The whole situation of demographics is not something that concerns me. I'm not scared about that. Today, Israelis, Jews, or just Jews in general, are more than Arabs. If we included Judeans from the West Bank and Gaza, they'd make up around 40-something%. So there would still be a Jewish majority, but even these numbers and demographics are less relevant to me, which is why I think we need to focus more on regional control, sort of tribal regions that we've always been, and governing ourselves in that way, so that there isn't this like mass control of better for one people or better for other people, but to be based regionally that would protect all communities, whether the Jews are minorities there or whether Palestinians are minorities there, but create something that works. Lastly, you talked about America's involvement. I mean, I think America only got involved with Israel after 1967, and we had 2 wars to basically fight for survival then, and we survived fine without America. So I'm actually against the US foreign aid to Israel. I don't think it's actually aid that gives money to Israel. It's not cash, it's credit, and it's credit into the weapon industry of America. Which shows that it's profitable for America to keep this going, because if you don't keep it going, you're not selling more weapons. So this idea that America is always in the middle of these conversations, but yet it benefits the most from this. Israelis and Palestinians are definitely not benefiting. I lost 6 friends. I don't know a Palestinian that hasn't suffered from this situation. So I don't think the average Israeli and Palestinian are benefiting like the Americans are. So I want the American involvement to be completely out. That doesn't mean that we can't have trade and relations in other ways, but they should not be involved in the Middle East. They should not be involved with our land, and we should be able to prop up the real activists from the ground to start speaking together in order to change this pop culture. And change can come. I know it's hard to see it now because we see in front of us this reality where there's like, war, and you see it in the media, and it's of course much worse in the media than it is on the ground. I live in Jerusalem, day to day, children are walking, people are living, almost every person is a normal human being and doesn't have an incentive or an ambition to hurt someone else. But the reality is that the involvement of America has always been something that has caused us to come to the conclusion that we need to fight each other. And it intentionally places itself in a way that makes it feel that they're more on the Israeli side, but I think they're more on the side of let's get this conflict to go. They give money also to the Palestinian Authority, they give money to the side of Israel. So it's not something beneficial. So if we look back in America, we go back 70, 80 years ago, you didn't have civil rights. You didn't have the right for women to vote, right? That doesn't mean that we haven't ended racism in America. That doesn't mean we haven't ended, misogyny in America. But clearly in 70, 80 years, society has shifted to today's generation. The average person, if you'd ask them, do you want to see a reality where there's segregation based on your skin color or women don't get a right to vote? Most people would say absolutely not. We can envision it because we learned history in school, but we would reject that. So how could we go in 7 years from that point to that point? And granted, there's still much more to do. Well, clearly there was a shift in mentality. There was a shift in pop culture. The younger generation used their efforts and their passion and their actions to change. And politicians either had to abide by what the majority wanted, or naturally the politicians were part of that youth that grew up with that mentality. So that's what we need to invest in. I'm not saying this is the answer, this is the solution, because that the idea that we're going to just impose a piece of paper and the solution onto the peoples, I think is also another Western perspective of imposing onto the peoples. It's a journey, it's a process. There will be many obstacles and we're going to have to overcome them together. But it has to come by, first of all, us humanizing each other, respecting each other, understanding each other's identities, not superimposing definitions onto each other, and being able to envision a reality that fulfills our aspirations. And I think that there are many theoretical options like federation plans that can give us the encouragement or the comfort to be able to actually, oh yeah, there are actually potential ideas. So let's start going about this. And it might be something completely different that we haven't even had the creativity to think yet. So I think that we start with this. We start with uniting the younger generation, using our passion to actually transcend this conflict and to be able to live together. Because again, the option of killing each other, completely wiping each other out is not going to happen. Kicking each other out is not going to happen. So we're left with two. Continue the status quo of one versus the other, or transcend and try something completely new that has never been tried.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I definitely think you're right on that. I think that the first thing, you're right, especially on that, this notion of we're going to come up with a solution, a one state, two state, one state, two state, one federation, whatever the solution, kind of having these world leaders come together and drop like, here's a new map and this is what's going to happen, I think is totally and completely unrealistic. I think you're right on that. I think that you're right in that And maybe what does need to be pushed, and I think, I mean, more power to you, and I hope you get this message out more, then the idea needs to start with stopping the hostility, stop waging war with one another. And I think it's important also to kind of, one of the things you mentioned with the lack of free speech on the Palestinian side. And a lot of that is because, you know, for them, it's considered an act of treason. They are at war, right? They believe there are people at war with an invader. So a lot of what they do is under the context of war. So if you do begin to advocate, you know, then that would maybe be looked at as viewed as treason in a way during war. It'd be the same thing in the United States if we were at war with Russia, and you know, some of us were like, oh yeah, what about, you know, it wouldn't go over well. So that, but the idea of the war has to, on both sides, needs to temper first, and maybe that is just the first step, which is just, okay, everybody stop waging war with one another, and then let's just talk and be and communicate, right? But you know, they view obviously settlement expansion as an act of war. There's all of these, and you know, having people move out of homes that maybe they don't technically own anymore, but they've lived in their whole lives or whatever. So there's these acts of war that I think are happening on both sides. Hamas firing rockets out to Israel. So that all would have to stop, and then there would have to be that dialogue. In order to get that dialogue, of course, the Palestinians need the access. You know, they get like 3G internet, and in Gaza I don't think they get really anything. You know, there does need to be this sort of awakening and dialogue with one another, and understanding and being able to see each other. um, so I do think you're right in that perception has to be the thing that will make the change, because that'll be it. And that's what's happening, what we're seeing already on, you know, even in the West. The reason why a lot of the youth is changing their perspective on it is, rather than just being staunchly pro-Israel all the time blindly, they're not blind anymore, right? Because of social media. And so that has changed even the conversation. I think it would change the conversation everywhere, right? If there was more of that interaction. And there are many, 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 many. And you know, and I don't want at all, you know, there are some real radicals, right, on both sides, but there are also a lot of very pragmatic people on both sides who do just want to live harmoniously together and have peace and be able to both live, you know. So I think you're right. I mean, but it's such a challenge. And wow, what a horrible conflict over there, because it is so complex and there's too many people involved, too many
Yeah.
groups seem to
I
be
think
involved.
there's definitely a lot of misinformation out there that is allowing people to come to certain conclusions, and usually those conclusions are, we're for this side and not for that side. And just viewing this as if it's some sort of soccer match where you need to support one team versus the other is just an unhealthy, toxic way of looking at the
Right.
situation. The reality is that the war needs to first end in our minds before it ends physically, because
Yeah.
it started physically because it started in our minds. And war is beneficial, not only to media companies, to NGOs that wouldn't exist if there was no war, to you know, the foreign aid that is basically funneling money into the weapon industry of America, but it's also beneficial for politicians. You know, right? Politicians usually from the right, for example, at least in Israel, usually are elected because they are providing security. And in order to be elected on security, you need to have some sort of reality where there's insecurity. So I would say that the fact that the situation in Gaza hasn't been dealt with has been beneficial politically in many ways. It doesn't mean that they created it, but they sure haven't done anything to change it. And when we look at the Palestinian Authority, recently with this recent war, conflict, clash, whatever one wants to call it, but the fact that many people have been killed on both sides, and especially also in Gaza, that started, you know, right when we were supposed to have the first elections for the Palestinian Authority in 16 years. Why
Mm.
did it happen right then? And why did no one talk about the fact that these elections were just went away and canceled? So, you know, people use war specifically in order to push a political agenda. And look at Hamas. Hamas knew with all of its rockets, yes, it's going to kill many Israelis. I mean, they also killed Israeli Arabs, not only Israeli Jews. They knew that they would kill people, but they know that this wouldn't take out Israel. They knew that this wouldn't change anything. They knew that Israel would fire back. They knew that Palestinians would be killed. They knew that this would happen. So why did they do that? Because now the result of them doing that makes them seen as the strongest opposition against Israel, which makes them more favorable on the streets, so that if there were an election, they would be chosen. That's why they
Right.
did that.
Right.
That doesn't mean that you don't have to stand up against the current reality, the fact that there's a aerial naval blockade, the fact that there's poverty there, the fact that there's, people not being able to leave, the fact that there's not electricity for a majority of the day. There's a lot of injustices happening there that we need to deal with. But if you care about the what, you also need to care about the why. Why is the what happening? And how do we change the what? Is by first understanding the why. And if we allow ourselves just to get manipulated by the what, and the people that are truly profiting from this, politicians, media companies, NGOs, weapon industries, are the ones that are laughing on the top while we're suffering on the bottom. So we need to have an awakening of the
Yeah.
greater picture, the holistic picture, and also create a holistic narrative and to end the psychological war that exists in order to eventually, bizat Hashem, inshallah, end the physical war that exists as well.
Well, I wish you success in this endeavor in changing the minds. I know that you're going out there and you're really speaking to people. And I think that is the first step. And I do hope that you are able to change minds and get people to, de-radicalize and speak to one another and calm down. And, but it's hard. But I really do wish you a lot of success in this. I think that your vision is, ultimately, of course, there's got to, work out all the kinks and all that stuff, but that's in due time later on. And I understand your perspective on that. I think, though, that your vision overall of trying to harmoniously just live together and everybody enjoy life and prosperity, I think is a really good vision for sure. And one that we all should be aiming for. Absolutely. So I wish you absolutely the best of luck. Unfortunately, like you mentioned, everybody loves a strong man. And that's kind of the problem on both sides, right? Hamas and the far right in the Israeli government is everybody likes the strong man who says, we're going to fight back. We're going to do what we need to do. And that is not helpful at all in this, because you're right. Neither side is just going to disappear. So Rudy, I wish you the best of luck. Thank you for talking, though, about this and sharing your side. I think that first, overall, mostly my audience, who does tend to be much more, sympathetic to the Palestinian side, needs to hear from someone like you, an Israeli Zionist who has a different view of what Zionism is, I think, than what most of us would think Zionism is, and a different perspective on the solution. So I think it's important that people hear from people like you more often, actually, to help dispel, I think, a lot of ideas. Certainly has for me. So I appreciate you coming on and talking.
Thank you for giving me a platform to be able to engage and for, being someone that tries to bring people together rather than try to pin one suffering against the other, which is what we've seen usually done in the media.
How can people find more of you?
Well, I'm on social media. You can type in my name, Rudy Rockman, on Instagram, on Facebook, on YouTube, Twitter, TikTok, and all social media. And there are many movements that I'm a part of that work on the land, such as Habayit. I would recommend people looking into that. It's an Israeli-Palestinian movement that actually does in practice what I spoke about here. Of course, sometimes we have to blur out the faces of Palestinians because of the reality that they exist and the dangers that they face. But yeah, on social media, Rudy Rockman. On Instagram, it's Rudy Israel. That's my Hebrew name. That's why it's Rudy Israel. But yeah.
All right, Rudy. Well, thank you. Thank you for being on.
Thank you for having me.
Here we go. Mute yourself. Welcome back to the show, guys. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed that interview with Rudy Rockman. It was very, it was really nice having the conversation with him. I felt like he had, I feel like his vision of how he views the region, I think is really interesting and in a lot of ways would be really wonderful, right? If everybody could just live in the region together, experiencing the land as they, according to what they believe and who they are. The Holy Land, I do have to say, when I traveled there, it is just such a unique place. And you can understand when you're there, to some level, you can understand why people are fighting over it. On one hand, you can't understand it at all. It's a desert. You're kind of looking around like, this place is what you guys want? There's nothing here. Why would you want to be here? But at the same time, because of the historical, just the history of the region, it is really highly sought after. So you have, obviously Jerusalem, which is important to three different religions, Christians, Jews, and Muslims. You have a variety of holy sites that, with those three Abrahamic religions, all three stem from Abraham, and anything from Abraham and before and often after is extremely important to all three religions. So it is just a really unique place in that way, in that this is where all three big, large religions converge in one space. And it's just such a unique experience being there for that reason, and visiting the variety of different religious sites that are so intriguing. I just really had, when I went over there, such a, I mean, it, I hate to say wonderful, because what I saw, the occupation was very intense, but the kind of the touristy stuff is really, really fun and such a unique experience. I definitely recommend, if you have the opportunity to go there, don't be afraid to travel into the West Bank. I do recommend you get a Palestinian guide. Personally, that's what I recommend, just because you get so much of the Israeli point of view. Being an American going over there, you already get so much of the, we already have such a disproportionate amount of, we get such a disproportionate viewpoint as it is right now as Americans, that it would be, I think, interesting for you to go over there and have a Palestinian guide and tour around the holy sites. Just to get that experience. And then they would maybe take you in to see the occupation as well if you wanted to go and see that for yourself. So definitely recommend going over there. I also recommend, if you do go, and what I would love to do is, since I've been over there with the Palestinian guide, I would like to go with an Israeli guide and see. There were members of my group who had already done that. And they definitely said that they had two very different experiences based on who their guides were. So I was one of the only ones that had never been there. There were several in my group had been there numerous times. I went with a bunch of clergy, actually, with Christian clergy, from Episcopalian to, I think, Lutheran Methodists, and a variety. But they had already been there to the Holy Land, of course, and with other guides. And so they definitely said that the experience, when they saw things from more of the Palestinian side, was definitely eye-opening. And what I like about what Rudy had to say was that, his vision is to try and get all of these groups to live together. He recognizes that there is serious oppression going on. He recognizes that it's a giant problem. But what he would like is for somehow to solve this problem where everybody lives harmoniously in one way, shape, or form with one another there. So I think that's a really nice vision. We'll see if that is something that can actually happen. Thank you guys so much for watching. I appreciate it. I do have an interview with a Palestinian gentleman that I will also be airing at another point, that has sort of a similar perspective, actually, to Rudy Rockman. So I do need to get that one put together for you. I do have to edit it. It was a little bit of a different type of interview. I was actually in the West Bank, and so I'm going to get that interview together for you guys and air that so that you can also hear from a Palestinian who's also living in the same area as Rudy. So on that note, guys, thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for supporting this channel. If you would like to support the show further, you can join my locals community. That is where you will get a behind-the-scenes look of what happens on the show. You also get some exclusive content that I'm not able to post other places because of censorship. So join my locals community. The link is down below. And to get that exclusive content, it's $5 a month, and you can have access to everything. You can also just follow the locals community as well. I do post a lot of stuff for free, so you're able to be there as well. So be sure to join my locals community. That is the best way to support this independent media channel. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you have any questions, thoughts, comments, you can either post on the locals community or email me, kim@kimiversen.com. And all right, guys, thank you so much for watching. Have a great night. Bye-bye.